Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for prayer. I don't know if you've seen the latest from Rebecca about Dave. Dave is evidently improving and probably is staying in the hospital overnight, but he has improved. I got a note from him today saying he's much better, thank you. So we'd be thankful for that. On the other hand, he still has an infection, a sepsis, so we need to be in prayer for him there. Are there any prayer requests from out here? Is there anything that you have that's not on our list? Lucille?
Over the weekend, my niece was in an accident. She was pulling out of the grocery store parking lot. She was making a left turn. And unfortunately, this car was coming out of nowhere and hit her roller over twice. All she received was lacerated arm. So she's coming along. So she keep me in the prayers because as serious as that accident was, chances are there's more going on than this. And I was very surprised that she did have her, she said, I said, why aren't you answering your cell phone? And what happened is the police still have her cell phone because they checked to see if you were texting.
Thank you, Lucille. Anyone else? Kathleen?
I ask prayers for a young man. His name is Jeff. Last name starts with K, not Y. Jeff. And he's a troubled youth. And I ask for prayers for him.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
I would like prayer for my dad's wife. Her name is Star. She has bone cancer and lung cancer. She's going to probably starting chemo soon, but she also has trouble. Her hands are very painful, and it's hard for her to even pick up silverware.
We keep starting our prayers. We have a long list of folks in need of prayer. You have copies on your table. When you take someone to pray for, read the whole thing. Because, for instance, the fourth request down here is from Geneva, asking for prayers for other people. When somebody's asking for prayer for other people, they need prayer too because they care. So let's not forget the person who's given the name, because they care. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. God, we thank you for your presence among us and for the fact that we occasionally recognize it. We thank you that you care about the people on this list and the people that we have in our hearts even more than we do. Help us to get a piece of the care that you have and show it to others. We ask prayers specifically for Dave tonight. He needs healing because he's helped heal so many people in the past. We pray that you would just touch him. Bring healing soon. Be with Jill. Now as we go into our program, Lord, we pray that you'll help open our eyes and our hearts so we can learn some more things about your space. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Geneva.
Everyone, let's turn to page number 513. Thank you, Lord. We'll sing three quick ones here. Yeah, page level.
Yeah.
513.
These are the delicate that broke my regular, circuit legislature.
What?
513.
513. All right, we'll sing this one time. I know I used to do it twice. We'll do it one time. Okay. So, I'm coming. I'm getting ready. All right. This is on my property.
outer space. God created that. Last week it was the earth. God created that. And as you think about the earth, you know, love has a saying, you know, we do our best, God does the rest. Well, on the earth, God has provided enough food for every person to have a 3,000 calorie diet. That's the amount of food we have now. We'd rather give it to our cattle and make gasoline out of it, but God has done that for us. It's up to us to do the rest on the earth. This week we're going to go to the place where a lot of the worship of God occurs, and that's buildings, worship spaces. Don's going to, who has had a little bit of experience with that over the years, and particularly helping us with our worship areas, is going to give us some insights to that. Don?
Thank you. Gary, lights? Yeah. Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Yeah. I can hear myself really well. Tonight we're going to sort of preview some history relative to worship spaces. And space can be outer space. It's limitless. The space we're going to talk about tonight is defined space, very much like this room. It has 3 dimensions: length, width, height, and in our case it's defined by walls, floors, ceiling. And it's how architects and designers over the years have manipulated those spaces, those 3 dimensions, to either satisfy a particular need, a purpose, or a spirit and a sense of space. It's that challenge that comes when designing worship spaces. This space suits our needs because it's more of a contemporary space. This is a modern space compared to a lot of historical stuff I'll show you. But worship spaces have evolved over 2,000 years. So the purposes now tend to be more general than they were historically. So the spaces become more functional and somewhat less dramatic. We still build some pretty dramatic churches around the world, but not as many as you'll see from history. The famous ones, the cathedrals of the world that you're all familiar with. The thing that we can do with space, for example, this room suits our needs, but theoretically it's not a very inspiring space. It's limited. And to manipulate a space, as cathedral designers did, if we took this space and sort of tilted it up on its edge, then we'd have a narrow space, but we'd have a very tall one. It changes the drama of the space. It changes the feel of the space. And that's what you'll see in some of the examples I'll show you. But to get a better understanding of that, what I'm going to do is take you back, way back, to the 1st century, okay, to the first churches. And when the Christians began worshiping, is anybody willing to guess as where they may have first worshipped? Church?
What's the present day Turkey?
No, in what type of building I'm talking? Location will come later, but it's believed that the first Christians worshipped in the temple with their Jewish friends. And typically they were isolated to the courtyard of the temple and not in the temple itself. But as the Jewish religion and Christians begin to separate, Christians and I'm sure the founders of this CBF started worshiping in somebody's home. Fair? And that's what the first Christians did. They worshipped in their homes. And the first, probably historical example that we come across where there's some documentation that it could have been the first purposefully built church was really a home. And it was in Dura Europas, which is in Syria on the Euphrates River. This is what's left of it, which was discovered in about 1920. What they found was this, and this was a home where they discovered that there was a 2-room home, but the wall separating the 2 rooms was removed, and a small baptistry was created in one corner. So it defined the needs of that church. There was further evidence, though, in the frescoes that were found in that house. And you can see, here's Mary and the tomb. These frescoes are preserved at Yale University. Nobody really knows the status of this building presently because ISIS got involved. So it may be there, it may not be there. Nobody knows. But that's be recorded as the first real church structure, although it really was a home. So we move on, and we mentioned Turkey. Christianity, you can see in the blue areas where it started, and it quickly expanded. And the trigger for this was between that earliest church and when Christianity gained all this area, there was a period when the Christians were persecuted, obviously. They either worshipped in their homes, or in many cases they worshipped in caves for protection and secrecy. Hence the catacombs, where they buried their dead. So what transpires over the centuries is a lot of the churches, the more significant churches, were built on old churches, on the foundations of old churches. Many of the old churches, when Constantine took over, emperor of the empire in the early 300s, 326 or something, Christianity became the religion of the land. So the Christians were free to worship again. So they started building buildings on the sites of old caves, on the sites of catacombs, where they had history. So that's where a lot of the churches evolved. And you'll see, historically, the spaces for many of the early churches, which were based on a basilica, the Roman basilica, which was more of a, it wasn't a temple, it was more of a marketplace building. And a typical basilica took this configuration. It was a rectangular building, a very simple building, and what is called an apse sat at the end. And that's where normally the governor or whoever was in charge, the court, sat. So that became sort of the predecessor of how we started laying out worship spaces for churches, formal churches. The configuration changes from one region to another. Many things influence the building. The culture, the religion that's being practiced in the facility, the local materials, the local craftsmanship. All of these things affect what we will eventually see as the final design of the building. But this, again, is historically how the temple was laid out. This was a temple and a courtyard. And that forecourt was really part of many of the very earliest churches. It was a socializing space, and then when it was, the early Christians used it as their worship space when this was the temple. But you'll see some examples. I have one example, I think, where actually the courtyard still remains. But over the centuries, the courtyards sort of diminished. They got lost, they fell over, destroyed, whatever. So we still may have a lot of basilica forms, but not very many courtyards. This is an example. This is in Rome, San Clemente. You can see the forecourt. It's a colonnade, and let me just back up a second. The typical basilica, which turns into what becomes cathedral design, is the side aisles. And this is what we would call the nave. the main body of the church. And then these are side aisles, and then they're normally colonnaded chambers. And the purpose for that were several. They served as secondary functions to the primary function of the nave, but they also over time became structural elements as these spaces became higher. These colonnaded aisles became structural elements to help to hold up the taller walls. And you'll see that evolution particularly when we get into Gothic architecture. But that's the general format, and most churches evolved around that basic plan. And again, these look pretty nice and pretty dramatic. These churches were started in the 400s, most of these, but this is not a 400 AD church. It was built on the site. It's been rebuilt. Any number of churches have been built 4 and 5 times on the same foundations. So it's hard to tell you what this looked like back in 400 AD, but this is more like one of the final form in the 1500s or so, as it remains today. The interiors again. This is St. John in Rome also. And these became very decorated and elaborate Romanesque churches. A distinction, again, you'll see as we progress. Romanesque is reminiscent of the half-round arch, which you'll see in all Roman architecture. This is an example of the side aisle now, the nave or the main body of the church is over here beyond this line of columns. So this is a lower height than the main body, but it's a side aisle. And it's used for, obviously, circulation space, and it becomes, over time, people would adapt these spaces and change them into chapels, small areas for secondary use. This is Santa Maria Maggiore, also in Rome. And again, this is an evolution of an original church that was built on this foundation. This one, I believe, was built near a catacomb. But you'll get the sense. You'll get the sense of how these start to evolve, and the height of elements, towers and domes, start to give them more importance. The spaces that we define with these walls and ceilings is punctuated by light. And one of the things in worship spaces is how do you take advantage of light or not? Some worship spaces tend to be dark and dim. Some tend to be very bright. A lot of the historical cathedrals have stained glass, obviously, which introduce colored light. The goal all the time was how to create a space that gave you the feeling that God was there. And bringing in light was one of the most important things. So you'll see, again, through the evolution, many of the earlier churches, because of the structure, they built these out of mass. They built them out of masonry. They needed real thick walls to hold them up, because the bigger they built them, the wider the walls. The more holes they cut in it, the more difficult it was to hold them up. So they built these by experiment many times. They build them, they fall down, and they build them again until they figured out how much stone to put in to hold it up. But as that form that we mentioned before, the basic basilica, which is still the heart of this, the nave, and here, now the asp in this case is kind of into this entire, and this is normally the east end of the structure, facing east. This became more dominant and stronger. The little asps, these are normally little chapels that followed around that. This was the high altar. And in this, you start to see the form of what is called a transept. This is a cross structure that runs across, this being the central port of the nave. So this is the main focus. In many churches and cathedrals over time, this became the central point. If you're familiar with St. Paul's in London, for example, that's a huge dome. And many churches use the dome shape over the transept, over that central area. Unfortunately, Notre Dame, that recently had the fire, had a huge spire coming up off of that. And then again, the side aisles. This one goes all the way around the nave. Over here, the narthex, the entrance, in the courtyard, it wouldn't have been here if there was one built at that time. So that again, this sort of is the predecessor of what we see in almost all the cathedrals around the world. The evolution of this plan, and you'll see, there are several main influences in church architecture. One of the main ones was the Byzantine style, along with the Romanesque, Gothic, and then came along the Renaissance, or the Renaissance. The Byzantines took this form, and in order to make it more functional, and let me just back up and give you a little history about how this space evolved over the years. The original nave the church was a one-room space. Over the period of Christianity in the early, probably the 4th to the 8th centuries, the priests tend to take more power. And if you know the history, all the wealth sort of trickled down somehow to the cardinals and the pope, and everybody else worked for them. So the practices in the church became, the central focus of going to church was to witness Holy Communion. So as the church became more powerful, each Holy Communion added a priest or two. So it got to the point there were so many priests, they couldn't handle them on the little ash, they just wouldn't fit anymore. So then they started moving out and took over. All of this area became the high altar. And then it became almost like it was their religion, and the congregation was back here somewhere. And then you'll see some examples too, where very elaborate screens, if you've been in some cathedrals, they have huge screens, hand-carved wooden screens that separated the high altar from the congregation. So you could barely see what the priests were doing, but they were holding their own communion service, and the rest of the congregation was back here sort of doing whatever they were doing, but they weren't part of it. So when the Byzantines started to develop their church forms, they decided it made more sense to bring the people together instead of separating. So that transition went from one room to what was called a two-room church because it was separated by a screen. And then the Byzantines took the form and made it into more of a cross. That last form we would call the Latin cross. The Byzantine form we call the Greek cross. It's got the transepts and the nave all be more like an equal arm, X. And as I mentioned before, Constantine, when he started to promote Christianity, he became famous for developing a lot of churches, one of which is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. That church takes on the Byzantine form. Here's the central dome. So the transepts of this and the cross transepts are almost equal forms, lengths, so that it brought the people to the middle of the church, where they were now close to the priest, and now they all communicated together. So that was the objective. Here's a very primitive example. I'm sure a lot of you have been to the Pantheon in Rome. This was a Roman temple, but based on the same premise. It was a circular dome, it was a circular building. Eventually this became to be used as a church. So it became more of like our form, where the people now became part of the service. This is maybe one of the most famous Byzantine, Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It has the central, I put the wrong button, I'm sorry. It has the central dome, but now this became a little more elaborate because as the transepts came out on both sides, these all had mini domes. So it became really a series of dome on dome on dome. So that's a good example of, again, the centralized church form. It's the interior Hagia Sophia. And the central, the big domes, here's a good example of that Byzantine form, or the Greek cross. This is St. Mark's in Venice. And you can see now that sorry, I'll figure this out. But, you know, here's the nave, which used to extend down very long, and then the asp up here. This, now you start to see the arms being very equal, and it becomes more centralized. St. Mark's has a dome here, these are all multiple dome spaces. So, but that's a very primary form in Christianity. Now we're going to jump to Ethiopia, where, again, this is a Greek cross. But the significance of this church, which is St. George's, it's hand-hewn out of solid rock. This is the area of the void around the church. This was all rock. They dug around, carved this out, carved the interior. All the decoration is carved out of solid rock. So it's very significant. There are about 8 of these churches that are carved that way in Ethiopia. There are others that are carved on the face of cliffs so that they were like 3-sided as opposed to 4-sided like this. But you can imagine the undertaking to do that. And to get down to the church itself, you go down this labyrinth of walkways underground and then come out in the base of it. So that's an interesting church. Here's another one. This is in Turkey. This is the Church of St. Peter, founded by St. Peter, they think. But this was a cave originally for the Christians of worship. And then St. Peter came and developed it a little bit further. And created the facade. This is, again, carved out of the face of that cliff. And the church goes back into a cave. It's not really very deep. It's only maybe 30, 35 feet deep itself. Another form, again, the plans of these churches are very limited. It's either the Latin cross, basically, or the Greek cross, where the basic floor plan starts. Another interesting type of architecture is that of wooden churches. There are some of these left, but as you might guess, if the stone churches burned down, the wood churches burned down first. So there aren't many, but there are some very good examples. This is the Bergum Stave Church in Norway. And staves are boards, just flat boards. This church is built out of boards. They're tongue and grooved together and stood on end. And they build the walls that way, in tier after tier, until they get this shape. It's an amazing structure. It still stands. The other form that was used, one of the problems with these stave churches were they were susceptible to high winds because literally they were vertical boards standing on it, so they may blow over if they don't burn down first. So the other method of building wooden churches was basically log construction. And there's an example later of. They became more prevalent because they were much stronger. And the log churches were basically set up on what the material they had on hand. So a log only came so long. So that the walls of the church were based on how long a log they had. So that instead of building square or rectangular buildings, they would normally build octagonal or angular buildings because then they could link the logs together to create a bigger space. But this is the interior of Bergum. And you can see how elaborate the woodworking is. I mean, it's amazing. Okay, now we go back to what we would perceive as being some of the major cathedral architecture, and this is particularly in Western Europe, England. This is Chartres in France.
I've been there.
Thank you. I mentioned that earlier. If any of you have been in, and I'm sure you've been in a lot of these, when I show you the cathedrals, if you have a recollection of the space, I'd like to hear it, because everybody perceives these things differently. But Chartres is a Gothic cathedral. And one of the significant features of this cathedral is the flying buttress, which was incidental with Gothic architecture. And it's in place of those aisles that I mentioned earlier in the basilica that helped hold up the walls. The flying buttress does the same thing, but it's much lighter and lacier. So it's not like a solid wall coming up with a roof, etc., like the side aisles were. These have penetrations now. This is the buttress, penetration to the interior wall, which allowed the architect to open up the wall with huge windows. And one of the major features of Chartres is its stained glass. Huge windows. Stained glass then was used typically to tell the story of Christianity, the story of the Bible. So if you could read all those things, you can go up there and read a chapter and verse from somewhere. But historically, they depict certain things that occurred in Christianity. But it's a very impressive church. It's not because of the dark color of the glass. It's not particularly bright, but it's colorful. And again, to some people, can be very inspiring.
I thought it was also famous for the lamp, how do you say the lamp? The circular lamp floor design, what do you call those?
Oh.
The lamp?
In the floor?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I can't, you use the term, I can't even get the word out. Labyrinth?
Lambert.
It's a design in the floor that goes circular.
Yeah. I'll show you another floor, but not
Okay.
this one. Okay. Okay, now we're going to really jump ahead, okay? In the 20th century, new materials, new technology started to change how we design buildings. Many of the older cathedrals, we haven't built too many new cathedrals. I mean, there's cathedrals still being built that were started 100 years ago or many, many years ago. But you don't see too many cathedrals because, first of all, they cost billions of dollars. And the technology is such now that to get 300 stonemasons to build a church takes a long time. So, anyway, over the years, that technology evolved into different forms and shapes. And I don't know if anybody's been at MIT Chapel. This is on the campus of MIT. Eero Saarinen designed it. And it's perhaps one of the simplest forms. It's a circle, obviously. The significance of this little chapel is that it sits in a moat. There's water down here. And although it's presumably windowless, there's a skylight. And if you see these tiny little arches down here, these are windows at the bottom of the wall. And what those windows do, here's an example. That's the moat. The skylight brings light into the altar, and you can barely see them, but it's very dim. The windows at the bottom are carved out of the bottom near the floor, and they reflect light off the water around the outside. It's very small, but very impressive. This is another pseudo-modern day church. Notre Dame de Caen. This is in France. It was designed by Le Corbusier a little earlier, 1955. But again, a total new form, able to be created with reinforced concrete, a new material that unfortunately ancient designers didn't have access to. And again, you can't appreciate some of these things until you're there and see it. This roof actually floats above that wall by about that much. So let's in a little bit of light. Along with the penetration, that little stream of light right up there is a separation of the wall and the roof. And the roof sits on little pins. But you can see what those penetrations, what look like random holes in the wall, all have different colors of stained glass. So again, it's a small chapel, but it creates a very inspiring and it's a great worship space because you start to appreciate what light can do in the space. This is another contemporary church. This is in Helsinki. And if anyone wants to try to pronounce that, it's the Rock Church, or the Church of the Rock. This church sits on top of a rock hill in Helsinki. And it was, historically I think it was a design competition in the early 1930, I think, before the war. And so they had competitions and they had a huge church plan to be built above ground and all that. So the war came along and they threw that all away and they started over again. And I honestly don't remember the architect's names, there were two of them, who came up with the design to build this semi-recessed into the ground. But their design was about 4 times bigger than this, and they couldn't afford to build it. So they basically reduced the form, and it's still a pretty sizable church. But this is carved out of the rock again, solid rock, and you can see where the natural rock is, and then they took rubble and built the stone wall to create the edge of the roof. And then the roof itself is a concrete dome. But these are little concrete plank, like rafters, with skylights all the way around this dome. So the entire church on the interior is lit like this. And one of the primary features of this church is its acoustics. Because of the natural rock, it creates a wonderful space for music, and it's used for concerts. It has a huge organ in it. You can see it somewhere here. But it's, again, a very inspiring space because it's different. Okay. We only had 2,000 years to cover. All right. I'm gonna run through these quickly, but somebody decided that these churches I'm going to show you are the most beautiful in the world. Now, beauty is in the eye of the beholder for most people. So, one of the most inspiring churches to me was the MIT Chapel. It didn't finish in the first place, but personally, it's a wonderful place to worship. But those who know better than I decided that these churches I'm going to show you are considered one of the most beautiful churches. You can ask different people and get different lists, I suppose. But anyway, we start out with this one, which is Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. This church was designed by Gaudi. He didn't start it. The church started construction in 1885 or something like that. It is still being constructed. It's not expected to be completed until 2026, maybe. And the only reason it's advanced, they expect it to advance, they introduced CAD design now because, you know, they have the advantage of figuring out all this stuff in computers. But this church, again, was the sole mission of Gaudi, who worked on it his entire life. Until he died in the 30s at age 75. The columns were designed to give the impression of tree branches, trees. It's very elaborate, obviously, ornate. It was in essence based on Gothic architecture, but with a little Art Nouveau thrown in because that was the period that he was working. I forget how many, these spires there are, a lot. The primary spire is yet to be built, and that'll be over the center of the church. It'll be over 500 feet high. So you can see the degree of detail and how long it's taken. An interesting fact about this was, the construction was delayed because of the Spanish War, and some rebels came in and destroyed the model that Gaudi had built to base his design on. It took him 16 years to put the model back together, let alone the church. This is another famous church, Duomo in Milano, Italy. It is the 8th largest church in the world. And I'm running out of speed. Must be running time to quit. But again, this is a combination of Gothic and Romanesque architecture. It's a transept design at Latin cross, but it's very lacy as you get the impression of all these spires and all the intricacy of this architecture. It occupies an entire block. You can't really appreciate the size of this. This is a huge church.
It's pretty dark inside too. It's one of the darker churches.
Right, because you can see the scale of the windows. Whoops. You can see the scale of the windows compared to what we looked at on Chartres, because of the way the flying buttresses allow them to open up those walls. And here's the interior of that cathedral. It's a 1/8 mosaic floors. Here's another church, and I'm sure somebody's been to Iceland, has seen this. Have you visited it?
That's the one we had the midnight concert in.
Is it nice?
Oh, yeah.
Now, this church is obviously striking when you see, this is the west end of the church. The inspiration was the landscape of Iceland. It's an interesting fact. This is a Lutheran church, and when they were building it, it was probably designed to go about this high. But the Lutherans decided that they wanted to show off the Catholics, who had the highest building in Iceland. So they added a little more height to it. So it is now the tallest church. But this is the interior. Again, it's Icelandic in design, Scandinavian design, because it's very simple. Yes.
All these churches, do you happen to know what denomination?
Most of the large
worship in?
cathedrals are Catholic.
Okay.
And this one, for example, is Lutheran, which is unusual for a large church. But,
So most of them were Catholic?
yes. Now, here's the back end of that church. And if you remember the first simplest churches, this is a simple basilica with one primary nave that did have side aisles. There's the apse. And only the front of this church has that very impressive facade. So I wouldn't put this on my favorite wonderful churches, but again, I didn't get to vote. Now here's a church, which again, this is King's College Chapel, Cambridge University in the United Kingdom.
3 weeks ago.
Pardon?
You were there 3 weeks ago.
Good. Barry can tell us about this. This is an example of a Gothic perpendicular style. It's a very tall vertical church, but again, you can see these the windows in this church are absolutely monstrous. They're probably 45 feet tall, so they are absolutely so the thing is flooded with light. The other thing notable about this particular church is the fan vaults. These are stone ribs that create these vaults in the shape of fans. And the ceiling is done in that entire fabric. So it's the best example of fan vaults in the world. Again, inspiring because of the verticality in this case. St. Basil's in Moscow. Anybody been to this one?
The outside anyway.
This is obviously, as you can tell, sort of Disneyland. A Byzantine shaped up, central dome, followed with smaller domes around the outside. Now, I mean, we've all seen these colorful images. What I discovered and didn't notice was when this church was built, it was all white. It was a white church with copper domes. And it was restored several times, but the last restoration, all of a sudden it became colorful and painted all these many colors. This is in Colombia, South America. This was a pilgrimage site. Originally it was a simple shrine. And again, this is a Roman Catholic church. The shrine was there because somebody witnessed a lightning strike that had the image of the Virgin Mary in it. And they made that notable, and it became a shrine, and then followed that by building this sanctuary. It's built on a bridge about 180 feet above the river. There are a lot of little mysticisms about the church. There's a portrait back here of the Virgin Mary, and nobody knows how it got there. So they say. Now this church, although not very inspiring from the outside particularly, anybody been to Wieskirchen? Okay. This is in Bavaria. It's notable not so much for its outside, but for its interior. It is Rococo architecture, and as you can tell, it is extremely ornate. It is white and gold, and just so elaborate that you can't imagine somebody actually did this. The roof, the ceiling is painted like a sky, so you have the vision of actually having the sky open to you above. And I think, well, I think it's real interesting. This is another surviving wood church. Anybody been to this one, Progos? Great. This is a log church. This is the primary church is here. This was built later as a winter church. That was heated. That one wasn't. But as opposed to the stave church, this is logs, horizontal logs, and no nails except for the shingles on the roof. So the logs are all interlocking walls. Interior, again, all wood. Maybe this is the last one. this is in Montreal. Again, from the outside, it's not super impressive. It's as a cathedral goes. But this church is known for its interior. Again, the colors, purple, blues, reds, is what is famous about this church. And it's, again, extremely elaborate. So it's a sense of what these spaces mean to you and how you react to them, whether this is good for worship or not. Also known for its elaborate woodworking. One of the progressions, which we didn't have 2 hours to talk about, was the progression of the pulpit from, the high altar down to more centrally located. So the pulpits are located now high, but also near the center of the transept, so that the priest or the parish priest could communicate with the congregations as opposed to being flat screen. So the bottom line is, you can worship anywhere. In the humblest of churches to the grandest cathedral. You choose. Okay?
I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions, no more than that, or Judith will get on the case.
Ask away or contribute. If any of these spaces ring a bell with you,
Well, the Gothic Cathedral is really impressive because when you walk towards it, you have to go upstairs to get to it. So you're rising up, you walk into this narthex, which is dark, and you step into the nave, which is just brilliant. It just overwhelms you with the beauty. And immediately you're ready to worship. And you can imagine being a peasant, living in a hovel and walking into worship.
When I was really little, I went to camp, summer camp. I went to Ocean Park, Maine. And the church there, it's called the Temple, but it was a Baptist church. And it's on the National Registry of Architecture. It's round. And the only thing keeping the walls up is the roof. It's like this room, there's nothing, no pillars or anything.
Yeah, but it's wood.
Interesting place.
Yeah. Well, again, some of the humblest, Delma and I love a little church up in the Adirondacks that somebody knows, I'm sure. A little church on the lake, you get there by boat, you can't get there by boat. But it's a little wooden church with no insulation and exposed studs and stuff. But it really feels like a church.